This is a podfic for We Got Peter! I wish he were my kid. Written by eccentric_Grace on AO3, read by Alexstress. Summary. Where's Tony? Is he with his kid? Steve froze from his spot at the stovetop, looking up with alarm. The wooden spoon in his hand hovered above the boiling water pot. Bruce kicked Thor lightly in the shin. Tony's got a kid? Thor widened his eyes, looked up and around like a startled animal. I wasn't aware Stark had offspring. Or 5 times the Avengers met Peter Parker, and the 1 time they realise who's training him. 1. Clint Barton. Clint Barton was the first one to meet him. His hands were blistered beyond belief from a foolhardy training session with the new girl, and with broken blisters brought blood. He just needed to get some band-aids, and one would think that an item as such would be easy to find in a compound designed top to bottom to cater to a superhero's every whim. But no. He's in the only place someone can apparently find band-aids, when suddenly this curly brown-haired kid stumbled in, looking the age of his eldest son. The kid wore pajamas, a faded NASA tee and a flannel pants, and he was walking while still hooked up to an IV, of which he held the stand beside him. He froze when Clint was very obviously staring him down, and had the audacity to look caught. Clint's getting real tired of picking up random kiddos that get themselves into trouble, so he cocked his head at the teen. Who are you? Peter? Peter answered with wide eyes. He had a healing shiner on his cheek, bruised a light yellow. What are you in here for, Peter? Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. He awkwardly lifted the hem of his shirt up to reveal his entire torso heavily bandaged. Then he grimaced and dropped his shirt back down. I wanted to go to the bathroom. Didn't want to call anyone for help. Clint pulled a face. He looked around the medical wing for anyone else in sight, but the place was dim. He looked back at Peter. Is someone supposed to be watching you? Peter shook his head. I'm supposed to just rest. Everyone else is asleep. Clint grunted. He looked back down at his hands and quickly peeled the band-aids out of their packaging, wrapping them expertly around his fingertips. Well, get back in your bed then. Peter complied easily, settling back into a rumpled bed just across from the cabinets of medical supplies. He pulled the comforters back up, and Clint watched as his nose twitched and his teeth clenched from the movement. Clint internally sighed. He closed the cabinet. So, what's a kid doing with an injury like that? You someone's responsibility around here? Is it Steve? Peter shook his head tiredly and tilted his head back on the pillow. No, not Steve. And the injury isn't that bad. It just stings a little. Clint walked over to the IV and narrowed his eyes at it. This is strong stuff. Looks like it's running a little low, though. Yeah. Peter frowned. It was dripping really fast, and it's almost been 24 hours. The doctor lady, Dr. Cho, said it should be switched out then. And where is she? Got called away on a mission, Peter explained. Something went wrong with some agents in Helsinki. They needed emergency medical attention. Clint resigned. Guess he was taking care of this one too. He walked over to the medical supplies and took a new bag of IV fluid before returning to Peter. I'm gonna switch it out for you. Hopefully that'll fix it up, okay? Peter nodded. So, Clint tore the opening. How'd you get the stab wound? How did you... Clint levelled him with a look. You think I made it this far without recognizing a stab wound, kid? Peter furrowed his eyebrows. Wrong place, wrong time. Clint didn't believe that for a second. He narrowed his eyes at Peter and then went back to the IV, closing the clamp below the drip chamber. And who's supposed to be watching you? The one who's asleep? Mr. Stark? Peter answered quietly. But he was worried sick ever since I got here, and I finally got him to leave and go to sleep, so I couldn't just call him back down here. Clint studied Peter carefully. He stuck the IV spike into the port and then hung the bag back onto the stand. Yeah, that checks out. Tony never can take care of himself. Peter hummed non-committedly. Thanks for drugging me. Clint snorted. Yeah, no problem. He sat down beside the teen's bed. Peter tilted his head at him questioningly. I'll stick around till those meds kick in. Clint shrugged off. He hesitated. How old are you? 16. Clint smiled knowingly and nodded. My son, the oldest one, he's 15. I thought you two looked around the same age. What's his name? Peter asked politely, looking quietly grateful for the company. Your son? Cooper. Clint answered gruffly. Lila's my daughter. She's the middle kid. Youngest is Nathaniel, Nathan for short. He nodded firmly. They're good kids. They look out for each other. I'm grateful for them. Peter smiled softly. Tell me about them, if you want. Clint scratched at his chin and leaned back in his chair, propping his feet up. Why don't you tell me about yourself first? You're kind of the anomaly in this scenario, kid. Peter grinned. Yeah, I guess you're right. What do you want to know? Clint had kids. He knew the best things to talk about with them because they were his. Nathan was the easiest. He was still a little itty-bitty thing that barely reached his waist in height, and his favourite topics were the talking trains on his television shows and bargaining for more bologna on his sandwich at lunch. Lila was the second easiest, because she loved archery. She's gonna grow up to be a class act like him. It's in the genes. So he'd bring her to the range and they'd talk about techniques. Cooper was trickier, getting into that independent mindset and all, and it was hard to get a sentence or two out of him if he wanted to figure something out by himself. Clint always got him to spill, though, props of working as a spy with a background designed to persuade information. But again, those were his kids. Clint Barton wasn't exactly the easiest guy to talk to either. He decided to settle for a middle ground if he wanted conversation. What's your favourite subject in school? Chemistry. Peter shrugged. It's really easy though. Well, there are AP classes for chemistry, aren't there? Clint tilted his head. You ever try out for those? Heard they're great for colleges. Where are you trying to go to? New York University? Yale? What are the other big ones? MIT. Peter nodded his head. I'm trying to get into MIT, and I'm already taking the AP classes. Clint blinked. Oh, well, all right then. You're set. Peter smiled. Guess so. So... Clint drummed his thumb tiredly against his knee. Tony, huh? Didn't know he had a... you. I'm interning. Peter rattled off quickly, a practiced excuse. He maintained direct eye contact, his chin jutted out with pride from his own lie. It did not go unnoticed to Clint. Oh, interning for Stark, eh? Clint said. I didn't know he had an internship program. Even more shocked a kid would sign up for said program. Sounds really boring. It can be sometimes, Peter shrugged. He glanced down at his own wound and broke into a sheepish grin. You wouldn't want it to get too exciting, though. Otherwise you end up here. You know what I mean? Tony's got a problem with employee health insurance? Clint replied dryly, just trying to draw more information out of this teenager. He still couldn't crack whether or not the kid was interning as an Avenger, or if he was interning for Stark Industries and just got caught up in something he shouldn't have been around. Wrong place, wrong time is a clever excuse, but not telling enough. Oh no! Peter furrowed his brows and backtracked. No, that's not what I meant. I meant more like exciting, like when Avengers stuff is happening and like sometimes that makes me a target for bad guys. Working here, I mean. Not like as an actual Avenger. Definitely not that. I'm just a kid. He sniffed in finality as he ended his sentence. Clint studied him nonchalantly. Sure. I feel really chatty all of a sudden. It's the drugs. That actually makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you get chatty and then you totally conk out. Oh. Clint tilted his head, studying the kid with narrowed eyes. He was all fidgety, restless as he looked down at his dripping IV, and then the folds of his bed sheets, and then everywhere else. Clint cleared his throat. I really don't think Tony'd mind being woken up, if it's his responsibility to babysit. He knew if his kids were in hospice, you wouldn't be able to pull him out of the room, and he would not give a damn how tired he was. That's just parenting. It's not babysitting, Peter argued, his nose scrunching up. I'm entirely capable, like practically an adult. Besides, Mr. Stark hardly sleeps, so waking him up isn't exactly on my weekend itinerary. Clint grunted. All right, well, try not to keep yapping. Try and sleep, will you? Yes, sir, Peter chirped. Clint leaned his head back and closed his eyes, listening to the hum of lights in the aircon. Silence for a few seconds, and then... Are you just gonna sit there? You can go if you want. I can get to sleep on my own, dude. Clint exhaled stiffly through his nose. Unfortunately, his conscience wouldn't allow him to leave till he knew this teenager was sound asleep. He couldn't just tell him that, though. I'm making sure you actually sleep and don't crawl your scrawny dumbass out of bed, Clint said simply, keeping his eyes closed. Can't wait to tell Ned that Hawkeye kept me hostage on the medbay, Peter joked, his eyes starting to droop and his tone beginning to lull. Bingo. One step closer to Knockout Town. Yeah. Clint crossed his arms and went back to being quiet. A few minutes later, he tilted his head up to peek. Peter was totally out cold, his mouth wide open while drool ran down his chin. Clint snorted softly and stood up to leave. He could have sworn on the way there he heard Tony down another corridor, bickering with Friday about getting out of bed to check on the kid. Clint's mouth pulled up at the corner and he disappeared into the elevator. Number 2. Thor. Thor was wandering from the kitchen when he saw the smaller Midgardian standing on the lawn outside, his arm outstretched with a strange device on his wrist. He lazily swerved his axe back and forth and watched the child with interest, and finally decided to go out and investigate himself. He swallowed the mouthful he had of bread. I've never seen you before. The child in question practically jumped out of his skin. He whipped around, his eyes wide, his jaw dropped. The device on his hand dropped and shot a strand of string out uselessly to the field. Thor raised an eyebrow. Oh! The child gasped. Oh my god, holy, you're on Earth! Yes, I'm visiting. Thor smiled wryly. Did they begin to hire new Avengers while I was gone? Little ones, specifically? Sorta, he blurted, looking upwards with awe. Then he quickly shook his head. Not because you were gone, just I'm in training. No, I'm not. I'm not an Avenger. I make the... Wow, you have really big muscles. Thor nodded sagely. What is your name again? Peter, the human said quickly, face going red. Peter Parker. Peter's eyes drifted down to the axe hanging limp from Thor's hands, and then they widened all over again. He smiled shyly. Can I try it? Thor chuckled with amusement, holding the axe out. He flexed it out a few times. Ah, this beauty. You can sure try, but it requires a very powerful heart, and you are very small. Like a splinter of the Yggdrasil. Itty-bitty. He shoved the axe down in the soil with ease and continued talking as Peter put his hands firmly around the handle. "You see, it was forged by the power of a star." Peter used all his strength to yank the axe off, but not even a portion of it was needed. The thing flew upwards, flinging grass and bits of dirt everywhere. It pulled itself over Peter's shoulder from the force of his strength, and he fell backwards into the lawn. Thor stopped, words simply evaporating from his mouth. "Oh my God," Peter repeated again. He slowly sat up, pulling the axe back over his shoulder with a lot more ease, and simply holding it out in front of him with his puny twig arms. Thor closed his mouth, opened it again, closed it again. This this man was now worthy of his respect. He smiled nervously, shifting around on his feet. Thor stumbled. He clicked his tongue. This is so cool, Peter huffed, grin breaking out on his face. He turned the axe over in his hands. Then he held it back out to Thor. "And that means I'm worthy, right?" Thor made a cringing noise, a so-so motion with his hand. He scratched the back of his neck. "What's your father's name, Peter Parker?" Peter made a face of discomfort. "Your guardian." Thor corrected easily. "May Parker?" "Son of May Parker. I must admit, I underestimated you." Thor sighed. "At least Stark can't wield it." Thor stood there for a moment, looking down at Stormbreaker with a thoughtful frown on his face. He rolled his eyes and looked back to Peter. "Do you know where Banner is?" Peter shrugged, looking caught between bewilderment and shock. Thor nodded simply. "Well, it was an experience to meet you, Peter Parker." He left without a second thought, leaving nothing behind him except a teenager stuck in an existential crisis. As you do. Number 3. Natasha Romanov. Natasha met Peter for the first time in the gym, the second floor of the Avengers compound West Wing. "You up for some combat training?" Tony had asked her, looking up lamely from his mug of steaming black coffee. He had bags under his eyes, dark circles heavily visible. "Why?" Natasha mused. "Are you feeling rusty, Tony?" "Ha ha. No, not for me. For some new blood. Avengers recruit. He spent the other night in the med bay. I'm not exactly anxious to have that happen again." Tony sighed. "He's got some basics down, and he's strong, but figured he could do better with some Spider Hero tips." That was all she was told. What she inferred was her own business. She sat on the mat of the gym, waiting patiently for the new recruit to come in. She heard the gentle swishing of the glass doors and the footsteps that stalled. Natasha turned to meet him. She's greeted with the sight of a teenager, complete with a backpack, a shy smile, and a nervous wave. He wore sweats, a t-shirt, and faded-out shoes that looked a step away from a shoebox coffin. "Black Widow?" he asked. He shuffled on his feet. "Or do I say Natasha? Miss Romanoff?" Needless to say, she was wary. She had her own morals on whether children should be able to fight, but she tried to keep in mind the circumstances. Whoever this kid was, he'd already spent time receiving medical attention from the other end of a fight, and if Tony was looking that exhausted over him, then he must be one stubborn mule. He'd benefit more from training than a scold to stay away from danger. Hero-type. Just like Steve. She'll give it a shot. "Natasha's fine," she said simply. She stood up and crossed her arms. "Are you going to tell me your name?" "Peter Parker," he said, setting his backpack to the side. He kicked his shoes off and stepped onto the mat, holding his hand out for Natasha to shake. Rookie mistake. Natasha took his hand, smiling pleasantly. She gave the handshake a second and a half before attempting her first move. It was supposed to go like this. Natasha yanks him forward, shoves him to the ground, and pins him with one of his arms held backwards. Easy. Something she was taught when she was 6. Instead, in the millisecond before she was about to move, Peter yanked his hand back. She saw a fleeting blur of Peter jumping over her. She swung around, raising an eyebrow, and her mouth opened in surprise. She pursed her lips, impressed. "All right, then. You're full of surprises, aren't you, Peter?" "I didn't realize we'd started," Peter said, exhaling through his mouth. He squared his hips and held his fists with focused dip in his brow. "Give me your best shot." Natasha grinned. Natasha kept a close eye on him, watching as he stepped side to side, not making a move. Interesting. She took a step forward, he took a step back. She took a step forward, he again jumped over her, dipped down, and swung his foot under Nat's leg. She fell on her back, looking up at the white vaulted ceiling. "Oh, crap," Peter said quickly. He lowered his fists. "Are you okay? That was a little hard." She rolled to the side, grabbing Peter's knee and swinging upwards so their positions were switched. She caught her breath, now standing on both feet, and watched with curiosity as the kid started doing something odd. He started talking, seriously chattering up a storm, scrambling himself up in an unpracticed manner and matching her move for move. He wasn't refined in the slightest, and he pulled his punches hard. Natasha had no idea how much strength he wasn't even using. His fighting was all slapstick, clumsy. He fought purely through instinct and with what Tony had properly summarized to her as the basics. Simple punches, kicks. He also seemed to rely heavily on his agility and flexibility, which Nat could respect. He grunted after being shoved into the ground and tilted his head to the floor tiredly, his chest heaving with breath. "Oh man, I gotta say, I'm really glad I wasn't fighting against you back in Germany." Natasha froze. She made a face and narrowed her eyes. "You're Spider-Man, aren't you?" Peter furrowed his brows up at her and wrinkled his nose. Yeah? I thought Mr. Stark told you that." She pulled back fully, clearly signaling the training was over. She caught her breath again and analyzed his expression, the details in his face. Youthful, stubborn confusion. She could see closer now some things she hadn't thought about before. This teenager had been fighting toe-to-toe with Captain America that day, a little over 2 years ago. "Tony wanted me to train you because you're going up against people who match your strength," she said bluntly, understanding now from all angles. "Because you don't know how to fight." She thought back to the dark circles under Tony's eyes, the exasperation twinged with desperation in his voice when he asked. Peter nodded slightly, looking sheepish. He was just a kid. He didn't ask for these powers, and yet he was chomping at the bit to learn, to help. Natasha held her hand out to help him up. "All right, kid." He looked down at her hand wearily. "You're not going to try and judo throw me again, are you?" She smirked. "Not this time. I'm going to teach you the basics on how to use that strength of yours. When I'm done with you, you'll be able to knock a guy unconscious with your pinky finger." He huffed with amusement and took her hand, allowing himself to be helped up. Awesome. So that's how Natasha got another nephew. Number 4. Bruce Banner. It's 4 in the morning on a Saturday when Bruce Banner met him. He had just woken up from a nightmare and felt green around the gills. Deep breaths were calming, but not enough in the darkness of his room, sweat dripping down his forehead as he carted his hands messily back and forth through his hair. After about 5 minutes, where the underside of his skin still burned and pulled where it wanted to transform, he finally swung himself off the bed. He took a cold shower, talking himself down the entire time the freezing droplets pelted his back. "This bathroom is too small for you, big guy." Bruce seethed his teeth, vigorously rubbing shampoo into his scalp. I'm not hulking out. We're not doing this tonight. His heart lunged uncomfortably, and Bruce scrubbed the soap on the green-turning skin on his wrists. Stop that. I'm not kidding around with you. Just forget the nightmare and go to bed. His stomach turned, his skin stretching out as Hulk morphed with the half of his face with an angry desperation. Hulk's voice came out of his throat, gruff and monstrous. No! This isn't a discussion. Bruce hissed back. He yanked the shower off, the handle breaking in his hands. He froze, inhaled deeply, and very calmly set the handle down. His eyes twitched. We're going to get a nice, calming cup of green tea, Bruce replied. Then we're going back to bed. His stomach turned again. Jasmine! Okay, fine. Bruce threw his hands up and stepped out of the shower, wiping the water off with his towel. Jasmine, fine, whatever makes you happy. 5 minutes later, and he's stepping out of the elevator in a new set of pajamas, his hair wet and dripping down the back of his neck. He walked into the kitchen and clicked the electric kettle on. He picked up a mug from the cabinet, put the tea bag in, and waited with a tight frown on his face. His eyes caught a light from the other room, coming from the ceiling. He looked up and then subsequently froze. A gangly teenager sitting quietly on the living room ceiling, entirely razor-focused on a laptop that he held tightly on his lap. Bruce blinked. He blinked again. The kid didn't disappear. Bruce isn't sure what to do. The teenager didn't even seem to notice the predicament he was in. A stranger in a high-security compound, who was also, breaking the laws of gravity. Surely he had to belong to someone. Someone had to have been mentoring him. Maybe Steve or Nat? He hoped for his sake that this was not Natasha's mentee, because then he'd probably get his ass kicked for staring. Bruce scratched his head and turned the kettle off before it could scream, then poured the steaming water into his mug. He sat and watched the kid curiously as he sipped his tea. There was a lot to process. Luckily, he's a scientist, so he's had some practice at processing. Peter guessed that the teenager had conscious control over what he stuck to, judging by how tightly he gripped the laptop in his hands and how he fidgeted once, resettling himself where he sat and still didn't fall. What Bruce thought was even more interesting was how the teenager's face was of normal colour. Not a hint of purple, not even red. He wasn't breathing in a laboured way either. Bruce had been watching him for 2 minutes now, and he looked entirely normal, when any normal person would start showing signs of blood pooling. With this kind of biological capability, Bruce's best guess is that this ability is tied directly to his genes. The kid narrowed his eyes. X squared minus 100 divided by... But if I use the limit theorem, then... Oh, my bad. I get it. The teenager huffed with slight amusement and then went back into a silent concentration, his eyebrows furrowing as he read along the screen. Differential calculus. Either a college student or an advanced high schooler. 10 minutes passed and Bruce had finished his scalding hot tea with little issue, much to Hulk's dismay. He kept his eyes on the teenager, waiting to gain more interesting details about the abilities he had. Then his stomach turned again. Bruce immediately glared. "Don't you do it," Bruce whispered. His blood burned and his heart pounded angrily in his chest. Hulk growled under his breath. "Stop it," Bruce grumbled back. "Cut it out." His fists clenched with the crack of his knuckles. "I'm done with watching," Hulk said defiantly. "I don't give a shit. Hulk!" "No!" Hulk roared, and his whole arm expanded and burned radioactive green. He reached out and shattered the mug, droplets of tea splattering across the kitchen. "Dumb science stuff!" And the illusion of being hidden disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Bruce quickly looked back at the ceiling and found a teenager to be gone, as if he had never even been there. Bruce glared at the empty space. I hate it when you do this. You scare away perfectly nice people, and you're never compliant with what I want to do. His chest expanded with anger. Hulk's eyes burned with rage, and he pounded a fist down on the counter.
You are dumb, not compliant. Banner stinks, Hulk strong.
He could feel himself slipping away, and his skin shifted mossy green. The Hulk roared again and swung his arm powerfully across the kitchen counter, the wood splintering in chunks while cabinet doors flung across the room. Hulk turned to throw a punch at the counters behind him, but his whole arm was halted by an arm unmistakably by something. Hulk grunted and looked over his bulky fist, and made eye contact with the scrawny teenager from before. Oh, shit, the kid breathed. Hey, Mr. Hulk? Hulk narrowed his eyes and curled a lip to show his bared teeth.
Move! Hulk smash kitchen!
How about I tell you a joke instead? The teenager said quickly. You like jokes? I know a lot of jokes.
Joke.
Oh, yeah. The teen nodded. I bet I can make you laugh. It makes all the superheroes laugh, and you're a superhero.
Hulk, superhero?
Yeah. The kid smiled and slowly let Hulk's hand go. Of course, dude. You're an Avenger. Hulk stared. So, do you want to hear the joke? Hulk jerked a tight nod. Okay, awesome, the teenager sniffed. What's a superhero's favourite drink?
What?
Hulk asked. Fruit punch, he said with a grin. Hulk paused, then he grinned and let out a boisterous laugh.
Good joke. Hulk like punching. Hulk smash.
And Hulk laughed and laughed and laughed until Bruce Banner leaned tiredly against the unbroken kitchen counter with the remains of his shirt draping around his neck. He looked up at the teenager with confusion. He furrowed his eyebrows. You just stopped the Hulk. The kid smiled back at him, eye bags under red eyes. I think that if I was even 1% more awake right now, I would be freaking out. Yeah, Bruce huffed. Yeah, Hulk isn't pretty. I wouldn't blame you. No, I mean, meeting you. He gestured up and down. I was you for Halloween was I was a kid. I had a lab coat and I carried around a printed out copy of your papers on gamma radiation. Bruce blinked several times in shock and disbelief. You dressed up as Bruce Banner for Halloween? When? When you were a kid? Yeah? The kid smiled nervously. He held out his hand. Peter Parker. Bruce stared down at his hand and then finally shook it, his movements stunted and lazy from his surprise. It's nice to meet you, Peter. Well, I really need to get to sleep, Peter said with a huffed laugh, looking up at the clock above the fridge. But, it was nice meeting you too. I'll see you around, Dr. Banner. Peter Parker was already well on a different floor before Bruce's mind finally caught up with him and he realized he had forgotten to ask Peter about his powers. Not to worry, because it was only the next morning that Tony stalked into his lab with a proud grin on his face and introduced him to Peter Parker for the second time, praising and prattling about how he'd found a brainiac teenager smarter than the both of them combined. Number 5. Steve Rogers. The first time Steve met him, it was completely and entirely by chance. He was standing in the elevator, hands tucked loosely in the pockets of his hoodie. The floors flickered down from 5 to 4 to 3, 2, and then they stopped. The doors opened and the kid bumbled inwards, backpack strung over his shoulder and earbuds in his ears. He's staring down at his phone. This bucket of bolts is never going to get us past that blockade, he murmured quietly, then smirked cockily. This baby's got a few surprises left in her, sweetheart. Steve's eyebrows furrowed in curious amusement. Part of him wanted to speak up, tell the kid it wasn't safe to walk around without hearing or seeing your surroundings. If he had done that when he was Peter's age, he would have found himself beat up in an alleyway behind the old theatre. The other part of him didn't want to seem old and lame, so instead he jerked his chin up.
What are you watching?
The teenager looked up quickly. His mouth opened in shock as he suddenly realized the company he was with, a look Steve Rogers was regularly given. He pulled an earbud out. Star Wars?
Oh. Steve nodded vaguely. I've meant to watch that at some point.
It's really good. The teen smiled earnestly. I started watching this in the car on the way here, so I'll have to finish it after I see Mr. Stark, but... Steve raised an eyebrow with interest at the mention of Tony. He cleared his throat politely, shifting on his feet to look at him better.
You know, I don't think I've ever seen you here before. What's your name, kid?
My name's Peter, he replied awkwardly, and fidgeted with the cracks in his phone's screen protector. Do I call you, Mr. Captain? Captain, Rogers?
Steve is fine.
Steve smiled teasingly.
Nice to meet you, Peter. Are you an intern? You look young. Not that I can judge. I was working at 8, passing newspapers to neighbors for a penny.
Yeah, I'm an intern, Peter explained, chuckling slightly. He cleared his throat. Still in high school, though. You know, it's really funny, actually, because I had to watch one of your videos for class yesterday.
Steve grimaced. Oh, no.
Peter's smile widened. I think I have your whole script, memorized. Hearing your voice saying completely different things is throwing me off. Steve felt his ears go hot. He was crawling in his own skin, hiding his face behind his hands and smiling tiredly.
Those are a long story.
So, Peter continued seriously over him, doing what Steve could only assume was his best Captain America impression. You got detention.
No! Steve laughed harder, hand on his chest. Why do they still use those? God!
After what seemed like an eternity, the elevator door finally dinged. Peter smiled at him. Well, it was nice talking to you, especially while not, fighting. Steve took a breath, confused, and recovering from the previous bout of laughter. Peter simply walked out of the elevator and saluted him with a grin. Bye, Brooklyn. The elevator door closed. Steve is left alone with his jaw dropped. Who said the youth weren't surprising? +1. Tony Stark. Rhodey wandered into the second-floor living room of the compound with the distinctive clinking noise of the prosthetics. He rapped his knuckles on the wall. Anybody know where Tony is? Natasha lounged on the white love seat against the window, looked up from her book. Is he even here? Well, yeah, Rhodey huffed. Where else would he be? Has nobody even seen him dig up here for coffee, like the star-nosed caffeine mole he is? No, Clint said, seeming against the floor and scrolling aimlessly through his phone with an expression of eternal boredom. Is he with his kid? Steve froze from his spot at the stovetop, looking up with alarm. The wooden spoon in his hand hovered above the boiling water pot. Bruce furrowed his eyebrows and put the chess piece he was holding back on the board. He looked over to Thor, who was so ferociously concentrated on winning that he didn't even seem to hear the conversation around him. Bruce kicked him lightly in the shin. Tony's got a kid. Thor widened his eyes, looked up and around like a startled animal.
I wasn't aware Stark had offspring.
He has an intern, Natasha corrected with amusement, giving Tony and the confused company the benefit of the doubt. Not quite his. Oh, that's his kid. Rhodey sighed heavily. He's a scrawny little punk. Definitely Stark blood. I'll go check in the lab. Hold it. Clint looked up in sarcastic awe. You mean to say that someone other than Bruce was let into the precious lab? It's just a safety precaution, Bruce explained in an embarrassed stuttered mumbles. There's a lot of dangerous stuff in there. But he's a kid. Intern. The elevator chimed. The doors opened and the two fools in question meandered out into the hallway. As they walked down to the living room, all the Avengers could hear a familiar voice, all of which had been acquainted to, ramble off. I'm just saying, I would have had more time to fix the calculations myself, but I got caught up on everything with this huge guy who was totally tearing up Times Square. Peter rounded the corner, smears of oil and General Mechanics schmutz on his cheek. He trailed closely next to Tony, who was grinning down at a holographic tablet and moving around parts of a digital suit rendering. Tony wandered into the kitchen. Yeah, I heard your report. I also heard via May that you forgot to do your homework again though, huh? What's your excuse for that one, kitty? Peter hopped up onto the kitchen counter, taking the tablet from Tony's hand. He started doing his own work on the render as Tony stepped around Steve to get to the fridge. Apple juice? Tony called out, swinging the fridge door open. We're out of the Capri Suns, but I put more on the grocery list for next time. Apple juice is fine, thanks, Peter chirped. He tilted his head and zoomed in on the Iron Man chest plate. Mr. Stark, what if we changed the layering of the arc reactor to fit the nanoparticles instead of reworking the whole thing? Tony hummed, tossed back a bottle of apple juice, which Peter caught without looking, and closed the fridge. He took a seat next to Peter, but actually on a bar stool rather than on the counter, and looked over at the tablet. Show me, he said blankly. Peter moved some things on the screen, wrote down some numbers and letters, and looked up at him. Tony scratched his goatee in thought, and then nodded. He ruffled Peter's hair. Yeah, looks good, kid. I'll get the prototypes 3D printed for the next time, and we'll put it all together. Awesome! Peter grinned. He cracked open the apple juice and sipped at it. He looked up at the rest of the living room. Oh, hey guys! The Avengers at this moment were all suddenly on the exact same page, albeit with varying reactions. Clint, who was smirking, an eyebrow raised, knowing and maybe even a little impressed. Bruce, who had now put together the pieces he had and was pleasantly surprised, beside Thor, who was only surprised. Steve, the most shocked, and Nat, the least shocked. Meanwhile, Tony, finally looking up only when Peter said hello, recognized the people in the room. He nodded in acknowledgement. Ah, Avengers, this is Peter. We know, Clint said smugly. Pretty sure we've all met him. Sorry? Tony furrowed his brows. He looked between Peter and then the rest of the Avengers. Oh, when did you meet each other? Other than the Romanoff and Banner, I haven't told anyone else about the kid. I met them. Peter spoke up. He put his finished bottle of apple juice on the counter and smiled. I met Hawkeye in the med bay one night, Steve in the elevator, and Thor on the lawn. That was really cool, by the way. Tony hesitated and then shrugged. All right then. Anyways, nobody can steal him. You guys can get your own Avenger intern prodigies. This one is mine. Looking at you, Rogers. Peter covered his face with one hand and stifled a laugh. Mr. Stark. Steve put his hands up defensively, giving a kind smile. No worries, Tony. Everybody knew it would be impossible to separate the two anyways, but anybody would be lucky to have Peter as a kid intern thing. Need proof? Just ask Tony Stark. End of one shot. Thank you again, eccentric_Grace, for allowing me to do a reading for this incredibly funny fic. If you enjoyed listening or enjoyed the story and you'd like to read more, I highly recommend you go over to their page and leave them kudos and praise and check out their work. It will be linked somewhere on this page. And as always, have a lovely day or night, whatever time it is for you. Bye-bye.